As the sun set on the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, casting long shadows across the war-torn islands, Japanese soldiers huddled in dank caves and makeshift shelters, their gaunt faces etched with the unmistakable signs of prolonged hunger. The year was 1944, and the tide of World War II had turned decisively against Imperial Japan. What had begun as a bold campaign of conquest across the Pacific had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival, not just against Allied forces, but against the merciless grip of starvation. On the island of Peleliu, where one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War raged from September to November 1944, Japanese defenders resorted to eating coral limestone to quell their hunger pangs, their teeth grinding away as they sought any form of sustenance. The vast distances of the Pacific theater presented unprecedented logistical challenges for the Japanese military. As American submarines prowled the shipping lanes, sinking cargo vessels with ruthless efficiency, the flow of supplies to far-flung garrisons slowed to a trickle. By early 1944, the situation had become dire. On the island of Bougainville, part of the Solomon Islands chain, Japanese troops were reduced to eating roots, grasses, and even tree bark to stave off hunger. The island's dense jungle, once seen as a defensive asset, became a green prison where soldiers fought a losing battle against nature itself. In March 1944, a Japanese patrol on Bougainville stumbled upon a field of wild taro, sparking a brief moment of elation before the realization that the improperly prepared plant was toxic, leading to several agonizing deaths. Lieutenant Yoshihiko Yamamoto, a survivor of the Bougainville campaign, later recounted in his memoirs, "We envied the dead, for they no longer felt the gnawing pain in their bellies. Each day, we grew weaker, our uniforms hanging loose on our skeletal frames." Yamamoto's words echo the sentiment of countless soldiers across the Pacific, their bodies wasting away as supply lines crumbled under Allied pressure. On the island of Kolombangara, north of New Georgia, soldiers reportedly boiled their leather belts into a gelatinous soup, desperately seeking any form of nutrition. The grim reality of starvation was not limited to Bougainville. Across the Pacific, from New Guinea to the Philippines, Japanese soldiers found themselves cut off and abandoned. On the island of Guadalcanal, site of one of the war's most brutal campaigns, an estimated 10,000 Japanese troops died of malnutrition and related diseases between August 1942 and February 1943. The lush tropical environment, teeming with life, became a cruel irony as soldiers lacked the knowledge to safely forage. In one tragic incident in October 1942, a group of Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal consumed a batch of unfamiliar berries, resulting in severe poisoning that claimed several lives. As supplies dwindled, soldiers were forced to improvise. On New Guinea, troops attempted to extract nutrients from boiled leather belts and shoes. In the Marshall Islands, desperate men resorted to eating sawdust, mixed with small amounts of sugar. These desperate measures often led to severe digestive issues, further weakening already malnourished bodies. On Tarawa Atoll, site of a fierce battle in November 1943, Japanese defenders were found to have subsisted on a diet of palm fronds and small reef fish in the weeks leading up to the American invasion. The Japanese High Command was not blind to the plight of its soldiers, but strategic priorities and dwindling resources meant that many garrisons were effectively written off. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, Navy Minister in 1944, grimly acknowledged the situation in a private meeting. "We send these men to die, not by the sword, but by the slow, cruel hand of hunger." This sentiment was echoed by General Hideki Tojo, who in a moment of candor admitted to his staff, "Our supply lines are our Achilles' heel. We ask our soldiers to accomplish the impossible, to fight not only the enemy, but their own bodies." Perhaps nowhere was the situation more desperate than on the island of Chichijima, part of the Ogasawara Islands. As American forces closed in during the summer of 1944, the 25,000 Japanese defenders found themselves completely cut off. By August, rations had been reduced to 100 grams of rice per day, supplemented by local plants and small animals. The island's commander, Rear Admiral Kunizo Mori, implemented a strict rationing system that prioritized combat-ready troops, leaving support personnel and civilians to scavenge what they could from the island's limited resources. The scale of suffering is difficult to comprehend. On the Philippine island of Leyte, where fierce fighting raged from October 1944 to August 1945, an estimated 80% of Japanese casualties were due to starvation and disease rather than combat. Similar patterns played out across the Pacific Theater. On New Guinea, entire Japanese units simply vanished into the jungle, their fate unknown until years after the war, when patrol officers stumbled upon bleached bones and rusted equipment. By early 1945, the situation had become so dire that even the stoic Japanese military culture began to fray. Incidents of insubordination and desertion, once rare, became increasingly common. On Iwo Jima, as the American invasion loomed, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi took the unprecedented step of authorizing his men to surrender if they ran out of food and ammunition, a stark departure from the traditional expectation of fighting to the death. In a letter to his wife, found after the battle, Kuribayashi wrote, "The men dig and wait, their stomachs empty, but their hearts full of resolve. How long can flesh and blood endure when pitted against steel and fire?" The psychological toll of prolonged starvation was immense. Soldiers reported hallucinations, extreme irritability, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness. Medical officers, working with severely limited supplies, documented cases of night blindness, beriberi, and other nutritional diseases. On some islands, death rates spiked as men opted for a quicker end rather than enduring the slow agony of starvation. Dr. Takashi Watanabe, a military physician on Saipan, recorded in his diary in June 1944, "Today I treated a soldier who had attempted to open his own veins. When I asked why, he simply said, 'To quiet the screaming in my stomach.' What medicine can I offer for such affliction?" As the war ground to its inevitable conclusion in the summer of 1945, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers remained scattered across the Pacific, many still unaware that their country had surrendered. On the island of Lubang, in the Philippines, Lieutenant Hiru Onoda and 3 other soldiers continued to hide in the jungle, surviving on a diet of bananas, coconuts, and occasional stolen cattle. Onoda would not emerge to surrender until 1974, almost 3 decades after the war's end. His story, while extreme, illustrates the lasting impact of the war's privations. Upon his return to Japan, Onoda remarked, "I had learned to live with hunger as a constant companion. It was harder to learn to live with plenty." Feast of the Damned, the Chichijima incident of 1944. In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where azure waters meet the horizon, lies a small volcanic island with a dark secret. Chichijima, part of the Ogasawara archipelago, became the stage for one of the most horrific episodes of World War II. As the tide of war turned against Imperial Japan in 1944, this remote outpost witnessed a descent into barbarity that would shock the world and haunt survivors for decades to come. The island, once known as Peel Island to 19th-century Western traders, had a complex history of colonization and conflict long before the war, with its strategic location making it a prize for various nations. The story of the Chichijima incident began in the sweltering heat of June 1944. The island, once a peaceful haven for settlers and traders, had been transformed into a fortress by the Japanese military. Under the command of Major General Yoshio Tachibana, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War and a hardened disciplinarian, the garrison of approximately 25,000 troops faced an increasingly dire situation. American forces were advancing relentlessly across the Pacific, and Chichijima's strategic importance as a communications hub made it a prime target. The island's radar and radio facilities were crucial for Japanese operations, making it a focal point for Allied attacks. As Allied bombers pounded the island's defenses and submarines choked off supply lines, the specter of starvation loomed large. Rations dwindled to mere spoonfuls of rice, supplemented by whatever could be scavenged from the island's meager resources. The lush subtropical vegetation, once a source of beauty, now became a last desperate source of sustenance as soldiers stripped bark from trees and dug for roots. By July 1944, the daily ration for Japanese soldiers on Chichijima had been reduced to less than 400 calories, barely enough to sustain life, let alone fuel combat operations. It was against this backdrop of desperation that the first acts of cannibalism occurred. On August 31, 1944, an American B-24 bomber was shot down over the island. Of the 9-man crew, 8 survived the crash, parachuting into the hands of their Japanese captors. The 9th, Sergeant Buford J. Ellison, went down with the plane, his body later recovered by the Japanese. What followed was a descent into horror that would later be recounted in chilling detail during war crimes trials. The first victim was Navy radioman 3rd Class Marv Mershon. According to later testimony, General Tachibana ordered the prisoner to be beheaded, but death was not the end of Mershon's ordeal. In a grotesque perversion of military tradition, parts of his liver were removed and served at a sake-fueled feast for senior officers. This macabre ritual would be repeated with other prisoners in the coming days. Major Matoba Sueo, who participated in these acts, later described the taste of human liver as just like beef liver, a statement that underscored the shocking normalization of these atrocities among the officers. As news of these events spread among the ranks, a terrible psychological barrier was breached. What had once been unthinkable became, in the minds of some, a grim necessity. Major Sueo Matoba, one of the key figures in the atrocities, later justified the acts by claiming they were a means of boosting troop morale and demonstrating contempt for the enemy. This rationalization spoke to the extreme psychological stress under which the Japanese forces were operating, where traditional moral boundaries had eroded in the face of imminent defeat and starvation. The fate of the other American airmen was equally horrific. Navy Airman Floyd Hall and Army Air Forces Sergeant Warren Earl Vaughan were beheaded on September 5th. Their flesh was also consumed by officers. 2 days later, Army Air Forces Sergeant Jimmy Dye met the same fate. Airman Glenn Frazier was killed on September 8th, followed by Airman Warren Hindenlang on September 11th. Each execution was carried out with a mix of military formality and barbaric ritual, a bizarre juxtaposition that highlighted the moral confusion gripping the Japanese forces. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Chichijima incident was the methodical nature of the killings. These were not acts of random savagery, but calculated decisions made by military leaders. Lieutenant Junior Grade William L. Connell was kept alive for several weeks, interrogated repeatedly before being executed on October 1st. The last victim, Army Air Forces Sergeant Donald Malloy, was killed on October 3rd. The extended captivity of some prisoners suggests a deliberate strategy of information extraction, combined with a twisted form of resource management, treating the captives as both intelligence assets and potential food sources. As these atrocities were taking place, another American airman was fighting for survival in the waters off Chichijima. On September 2nd, a young Navy pilot named George H.W. Bush was shot down during a bombing run. Unlike his less fortunate comrades, Bush was rescued by the submarine USS Finback, narrowly escaping the fate that befell the others. Bush would go on to become the 41st President of the United States, but the memory of that day and the knowledge of what happened to other downed airmen would stay with him for the rest of his life. In his autobiography, Bush wrote, "I think about those guys all the time, a poignant reminder of the lasting impact of war's horrors on even those who survive." The full extent of the Chichijima atrocities only came to light after Japan's surrender in August 1945. As American forces occupied the island, they were confronted with evidence of unspeakable crimes. Exhumations revealed the mutilated remains of the airmen, and survivors among the Japanese ranks began to talk. Lieutenant George Onishi, a Japanese naval officer who had been stationed on Chichijima, provided crucial testimony that helped piece together the events of those terrible months. The cannibal general, Yoshio Tachibana's reign of terror on Chichijima. In the annals of World War II, few stories are as chilling and grotesque as that of General Yoshio Tachibana's command on the remote island of Chichijima. As the Pacific War raged and Imperial Japan's empire crumbled, this once respected military leader presided over a descent into barbarity that would shock the world and forever tarnish his legacy. The tale of Tachibana serves as a grim reminder of the words of English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who wrote, "In war, the laws are silent," a maxim that would be tragically realized on this small Pacific island. Yoshio Tachibana was born in 1890 in Japan's Nagano Prefecture, a mountainous region known for its harsh winters and resilient people. A career military man, he had risen through the ranks with distinction, serving in China and Manchuria before being assigned to the strategically vital island of Chichijima in the Ogasawara archipelago. His early career was marked by commendations for bravery and leadership, including the Order of the Golden Kite, 4th class, awarded for his service in the Russo-Japanese War. By 1944, as the tide of war turned inexorably against Japan, Tachibana found himself commanding a garrison of approximately 25,000 men on an island slowly being strangled by Allied forces. The 54-year-old general was known for his stern demeanor and strict adherence to military discipline. Survivors later recounted how Tachibana would personally oversee morning drills, his piercing gaze instilling both fear and respect in his troops. Yet as supplies dwindled and American bombers pounded the island relentlessly, Tachibana's leadership took a dark turn. Tachibana's influence over his subordinates was evident in the way these acts were carried out. Major Sueo Matoba, one of the key figures in the atrocities, later testified that he believed the cannibalism was sanctioned by his superiors. "We were following orders," Matoba claimed during his trial, echoing a defense that would be heard in war crimes tribunals across the globe. The general's orders created an atmosphere where the unthinkable became not only possible, but somehow acceptable in the twisted logic of a besieged garrison. As the situation on Chichijima deteriorated, Tachibana's control over his men became increasingly tenuous. Rations had been reduced to less than 400 calories per day by July 1944, barely enough to sustain life. Soldiers resorted to eating insects, tree bark, and even boiled grass to stave off starvation. In this environment of extreme deprivation, the general's earlier sanction of cannibalism opened the floodgates to further atrocities. On September 5, 1944, Navy Airman Floyd Hall and Army Air Forces Sergeant Warren Earl Vaughan were executed and their flesh consumed. 2 days later, Army Air Forces Sergeant Jimmy Dye met the same fate. The pattern continued with Airman Glenn Fraser on September 8th and Airman Warren Hindenlang on September 11th. Each execution was carried out with a mix of military formality and barbaric ritual, a bizarre juxtaposition that highlighted the moral confusion gripping the Japanese forces under Tachibana's command. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Tachibana's command was the methodical nature of these killings. These were not acts of random savagery, but calculated decisions made by a military leader. Lieutenant Junior Grade William L. Connell was kept alive for several weeks, interrogated repeatedly before being executed on October 1st. The last victim, Army Air Forces Sergeant Donald Malloy, was killed on October 3rd. Tachibana personally oversaw the interrogations, demonstrating a cold efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the barbaric nature of the acts he was sanctioning. Throughout this period, Tachibana maintained a facade of military order. Daily routines continued, reports were filed, and the defense of the island was organized. This juxtaposition of mundane military life with acts of unspeakable barbarity underscores the moral vacuum that had developed under Tachibana's leadership. Captain Yoshi Tadashi, one of Tachibana's staff officers, later described the surreal atmosphere. We would discuss defense strategies in the morning and attend cannibal feasts in the evening. It was as if we were living in two different worlds. The general's failure to control the practice of cannibalism once it had begun is evident in the testimonies of survivors. Some Japanese soldiers, horrified by what was happening, risked severe punishment to secretly bury the remains of American airmen to prevent further desecration. Private Fumio Kido, who was later decorated for his post-war testimony, recalled burying the remains of an American airman under cover of darkness, saying, "I couldn't bear to see another human being treated like an animal. Even in war, there must be limits." As news of the atrocities spread among the troops, discipline began to break down further. Tachibana's authority, once absolute, was now maintained through a combination of fear and the shared guilt of those who had participated in the cannibalism. The general, who had once been revered for his strict adherence to military protocol, now presided over a garrison where the most basic tenets of human decency had been abandoned. Lieutenant George Onishi, a Japanese naval officer who provided crucial testimony after the war, described the atmosphere as a descent into hell, led by a man we once thought incapable of such cruelty. The horrors of Chichijima were not limited to Allied prisoners. As food supplies dwindled, even Japanese soldiers fell victim to cannibalism. Private Yoshio Kono, in a post-war interview, described how some of his comrades disappeared mysteriously, only to reappear as meat in the communal pot. "We were like walking skeletons," Kono recalled. "Some men went mad with hunger. That's when the whispers about eating the prisoners started. But it didn't stop there. No one was safe." Flesh and fear. Voices from the Cannibal Island. In the vast expanse of the Pacific Theater during World War II, few places held as much terror for Allied airmen as the tiny island of Chichijima. This remote speck of land, part of the Ogasawara archipelago, became the site of unspeakable horrors that would haunt survivors for decades to come. Through the testimonies of those who lived through this nightmare, we gain a chilling glimpse into the depths of human depravity and the unimaginable circumstances that can drive men to commit the most heinous acts. As George Orwell once wrote, "If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face, forever." For the prisoners of Chichijima, this dystopian vision became a horrifying reality. The story of Chichijima's descent into cannibalism began in earnest on June 30th, 1944, when a US Navy Hellcat fighter, piloted by Lieutenant William Elder, was shot down over the island. Elder managed to bail out and was quickly captured by Japanese forces. What he witnessed in the following days would scar him for life. The island, once a peaceful paradise known for its unique ecology and the bone-in petrel, a seabird found nowhere else on Earth, had been transformed into a hellscape of human cruelty. "I thought being shot down was the worst thing that could happen to me," Elder recounted years later in a tear-filled interview with historian Laura Hillenbrand, author of Unbroken. "I had no idea what hell awaited me on that godforsaken island." Elder described being brought before a group of Japanese officers, including the infamous General Yoshio Tachibana, in a makeshift interrogation room that had once been a coconut processing plant. The air was thick with the cloying scent of rotting fruit and fear. It was during this initial interrogation that Elder first heard the word kusanagi whispered among his captors. He would later learn that this term, which literally means grass cutter, was used as a euphemism for cannibalism. The term had a dark historical significance, referring to the legendary sword of the Japanese Imperial regalia. "The way they looked at me," Elder recalled, his voice trembling, "it was like I wasn't human anymore. I was just meat to them. I remembered reading about the Donner Party in school, but I never imagined I'd be facing something even worse." Elder's testimony aligns chillingly with that of Raymond Hap Halloran, a B-29 navigator who was shot down over Tokyo on January 27, 1945, and later transferred to Chichijima. Halloran's experience provides a harrowing account of the psychological torture inflicted on prisoners who lived under the constant threat of cannibalism. Halloran, who had survived the firebombing of Tokyo only to face a more terrifying ordeal, would later say that the horrors of Chichijima made the inferno of Tokyo seem like a walk in the park. They would come into our cells at night, Halloran recounted, his eyes distant with the memory, and run their fingers along our arms and legs like they were appraising cattle. One guard, he told me in broken English, "You fat, you taste good. I've never known terror like that." Halloran described how the prisoners would try to stay awake at night, fearing that sleep might mean never waking up again. They developed a system of quiet signals and whispers to check on each other hourly, a grim roll call of the living. The fear of being eaten alive was not unfounded. On August 31st, 1944, a B-24 bomber nicknamed Lonesome Lady was shot down over Chichijima. Of the 9-man crew, 8 survived the crash, only to face a fate worse than death. Navy radioman 3rd Class Marv Mershon was one of the unfortunate victims. His crewmate, gunner James D. Clark, was forced to watch as Mershon was beheaded and his liver removed for consumption. Clark's testimony, given during the war crimes trials in Guam in 1946, was so graphic that several jurors had to leave the courtroom. "They cut him open like he was a fish," Clark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And then they ate him, right there in front of us. They were laughing, drinking sake. It was like a party to them." Clark described how one officer, later identified as Lieutenant Jiro Nakahara, seemed to take particular pleasure in the act, even offering a toast with a cup filled with what appeared to be blood. The horror didn't end with Mershon. Over the next few months, more Allied airmen would fall victim to the cannibalistic practices on Chichijima. Army Air Force's Sergeant Jimmy Dye, shot down on September 1st, 1944, managed to survive for several days before succumbing to his captor's hunger. His fellow prisoner, Marine pilot Warren Earl Vaughan, recorded Dye's last words in a secret diary he kept hidden. "If you make it out of here, tell my family I love them, and tell the world what happened on this island." Vaughan had ingeniously fashioned the diary from scraps of rice paper and a pencil stub he had managed to conceal in the lining of his flight jacket. Vaughan himself would not survive to tell the tale, but his diary, discovered after the war, provided crucial evidence of the atrocities committed on Chichijima. The diary also contained poignant personal reflections, including a haiku Vaughan had composed in his final days. "Hungry eyes watching, in this green hell of islands, man becomes the prey." This simple yet powerful verse captured the essence of the terror that gripped the prisoners of Chichijima. Perhaps one of the most chilling accounts came from Navy Airman Floyd Hall, who was captured on September 3rd, 1944. Hall managed to escape briefly and witnessed the preparation of human remains for consumption. "They had a big pot, like something you'd cook stew in," Hall testified. "But what was in it? It wasn't stew. I saw a human hand just floating there in the broth. I vomited right there and then, and that's how they found me." Hall's testimony was particularly significant as it corroborated the accounts of other survivors and provided direct evidence of the cannibalistic practices. Hall's testimony was corroborated by Japanese soldier Takehiko Tazaki, who defected after the war and provided detailed accounts of the cannibalistic practices. Tazaki described how the flesh was often prepared with soy sauce and vegetables, as if it were any other meat. "The officers tried to make it seem normal," Tazaki said. "They told us it was necessary for our survival, that it would give us strength. But how can eating another human being ever be normal?" The psychological impact on the survivors was profound. Lieutenant John Balcom, one of the few who managed to escape Chichijima, spoke of the lasting trauma. "For years after the war, I couldn't look at meat without feeling sick," Balcom said. "The nightmares, they never really go away. You don't just forget something like that." Balcom's experience highlights the long-term effects of such trauma, a subject that would later be studied extensively in the context of post-traumatic stress disorder among war veterans. These eyewitness accounts painted a picture of an island where the rules of warfare and basic human decency had completely broken down. The testimony of Ensign Richard Volhoff, who spent 3 harrowing weeks on Chichijima in October 1944, highlighted the bizarre juxtaposition of military formality and savage brutality. They would torture us for information during the day, Volhoff recalled, and then at night we'd hear them singing and laughing. The smell of cooking meat would waft into our cells. We knew what it was, who it was. It was like being in a madhouse. Volhoff's account is particularly chilling, as it describes the methodical nature of the atrocities, carried out with a veneer of military discipline. The survivors' stories also shed light on the few acts of kindness amidst the horror. Private Fumio Kido, a Japanese soldier who risked his life to secretly provide food to the prisoners, was remembered by several Allied airmen. "If it wasn't for Kido, I don't think any of us would have made it," said Staff Sergeant Joseph Caruso, who spent 2 months on Chichijima. He was the only one who still saw us as human beings. Kido's actions serve as a powerful reminder of the capacity for moral courage, even in the darkest of circumstances, echoing the words of Martin Luther King Jr. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. As the war drew to a close and Allied forces closed in on Japan, the situation on Chichijima became even more desperate. The final known victim of cannibalism on the island was Sergeant Donald Malloy, killed on October 3, 1944. His fate was witnessed by Flight Officer William Connell, who provided a detailed account of Malloy's last moments. "They took him away, and we all knew what was going to happen," Connell testified. Malloy knew, too. His last words to us were, "Don't let them forget what happened here." Connell's testimony was particularly poignant, as it highlighted the prisoners' determination to bear witness, even in their final moments. Flesh on Trial, the reckoning of wartime cannibalism. In the somber aftermath of World War II, as the world grappled with the enormity of the atrocities committed, a series of war crimes trials unfolded that would bring to light some of the most horrifying acts of human depravity. Among these, the trials addressing the issue of cannibalism stood out as particularly chilling, forcing jurors, judges, and the public to confront the darkest depths of human nature. As philosopher Hannah Arendt would later observe in her work on the banality of evil, the sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. This sentiment echoed through the halls of justice as the world confronted the unthinkable. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which ran from May 3, 1946 to November 12, 1948, was the primary stage for many of these harrowing cases. In the austere courtroom of the former Imperial Army headquarters, located in the Ichigaya district of Tokyo, the air thick with tension and the weight of unspeakable crimes, prosecutors presented evidence that would make even the most hardened veterans blanch. The tribunal, officially known as the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, was established by a special proclamation of General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers in Japan. One of the most notorious cases involved Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, whose name had become synonymous with the horrors that transpired on Chichijima Island. As the evidence against Tachibana mounted, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Witnesses recounted how Tachibana had not only condoned, but actively participated in the execution and consumption of American prisoners of war. The island of Chichijima, part of the Ogasawara archipelago, had been the site of numerous documented cases of cannibalism between 1944 and 1945. Former Private Tomematsu Tsuda, his voice barely rising above a whisper, testified, "I saw General Tachibana slice flesh from the thigh of an American airman. He consumed it as casually as one might eat a piece of fruit." The gallery erupted in murmurs of disgust, while Tachibana sat impassively, his face a mask of indifference. Tsuda's testimony was particularly powerful, as he had been a cook's assistant and had direct knowledge of the preparation of human flesh for consumption. The prosecution, led by the formidable Joseph B. Keenan, an American lawyer who had previously served as an assistant to the U.S. Attorney General, presented physical evidence that turned stomachs, and challenged the very bounds of human comprehension. Photographs of mutilated bodies, testimonies from survivors, and even utensils used in the gruesome acts were laid bare before the court. One particularly disturbing piece of evidence was a sake cup that had allegedly been used to drink the blood of executed prisoners, a grim testament to the ritualistic nature of some of the acts. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of Surgeon Lieutenant Akira Makizawa, who had been ordered to remove the livers and thighs of executed prisoners for officers' consumption. Makizawa, his hands shaking as he recounted the events, stated, "I was told it was for medical experiments, but we all knew what it was really for." His words hung in the air, a testament to the moral corruption that had infected the highest ranks of the Japanese military. Makizawa's testimony also revealed that certain organs, particularly the liver, were considered delicacies and were often reserved for high-ranking officers. The trial also brought to light the case of Major Matoba Sueo, who had been stationed on Chichijima. Survivors spoke of Matoba's particular cruelty, describing how he would select prisoners for execution based on their perceived meatiness. One former prisoner, James Bradley, recalled with horror, "Matoba would eye us like cattle at auction. He'd point and say, 'That one looks tasty.'" Bradley's testimony was so graphic that 2 jurors had to be excused, overcome by nausea. Bradley, who had miraculously survived his ordeal on Chichijima, would later author a book titled Flyboys, a true story of courage, detailing his experiences and those of his fellow airmen. As the trial progressed, it became clear that cannibalism was not an isolated incident, but a systematic practice on Chichijima. The court heard evidence of at least 100 confirmed cases of cannibalism involving Allied prisoners. The true number, it was suggested, could be much higher. One of the most shocking revelations was that the practice had begun as early as February 1944, long before food shortages became critical on the island. The defense attempted to argue that extreme conditions and food shortages had driven the accused to such desperate measures. However, this argument crumbled in the face of evidence showing that the practice had begun well before supplies ran critically low. As prosecutor Franklin Ian Warren eloquently put it, "Starvation may explain theft, but it does not justify murder and cannibalism." Warren's words echoed the sentiment of many who believed that there were moral lines that should never be crossed, even in the direst circumstances. On September 19, 1947, after months of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Tachibana and 4 other officers were found guilty of war crimes, including cannibalism. The sentence was death by hanging. As the judgment was read, Tachibana finally showed emotion, his face contorting in a mixture of rage and fear. The execution was carried out on September 24, 1947, at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo, marking the end of one of the most disturbing chapters in the annals of war crimes trials. The Chichijima trials were not the only ones to address cannibalism. In Guam, a series of trials known as the Guam War Crimes Trials took place from 1946 to 1949. These trials, while less publicized than the Tokyo Tribunal, dealt with equally disturbing cases. The trials were held at the Island Command Courtroom on Guam, a converted military building that became the site of over 100 individual trials. One such case involved Captain Shizuo Yoshi, who was accused of ordering the execution and cannibalization of American airmen on Palau. A former subordinate, Petty Officer Yushin Komine, provided chilling testimony. Captain Yoshi told us eating the enemy would give us courage. He said their strength would become ours. Yoshii was found guilty and executed on June 18, 1947. The case of Yoshii was particularly significant, as it demonstrated that the practice of cannibalism was not limited to Chichijima, but had spread to other Pacific islands under Japanese control. The trials also revealed the psychological toll on those who had been forced to participate in or witness these acts. Many Japanese soldiers called to testify broke down on the stand. One such soldier, Private Takeo Abe, sobbed as he recounted, "I can still hear the sound of flesh being cut. It haunts my dreams. I don't think I'll ever be free of it." Abe's testimony highlighted the lasting trauma inflicted not only on the victims, but also on those compelled to participate in such atrocities. The issue of cannibalism presented unique legal challenges. While murder and torture were clearly defined war crimes, the specific act of cannibalism was not explicitly covered in international law. Prosecutors had to argue that it fell under the broader category of inhumane treatment and outrages upon personal dignity. This legal ambiguity led to intense debates among jurists and legal scholars, forcing them to grapple with how to codify and prosecute acts that were beyond the pale of normal human behavior. Despite these challenges, the trials succeeded in bringing many perpetrators to justice. Beyond Tachibana and Yoshio, dozens of lower-ranking officers and soldiers were convicted for their roles in cannibalistic acts. Sentences ranged from long prison terms to execution. One notable case was that of Warrant Officer Yuki Ogata, who received a 10-year sentence for his role in preparing human flesh for consumption, although he claimed he was following orders under duress. The trials had a profound impact on international law. They set precedents for how to deal with extreme war crimes and influenced the development of the Geneva Conventions. The explicit prohibition of outrages upon personal dignity in the 1949 Geneva Conventions was, in part, a response to the horrors revealed in these trials. Article 3 of the Convention, which applies to non-international armed conflicts, specifically prohibits outrages upon personal dignity, in particular humiliating and degrading treatment. The legacy of these trials extends beyond their immediate legal impact. They have become the subject of numerous historical studies, documentaries, and even works of fiction. Books like Flyboys by James Bradley and The Naked and the Dead by Norman Mailer draw inspiration from these events, ensuring that the lessons learned are not forgotten. As we close this chapter of history, we're left to grapple with the grim realities of human desperation in wartime. The instances of cannibalism among Japanese soldiers during World War II, particularly on isolated Pacific islands, stand as a stark reminder of the depths to which conflict can drive individuals. Perhaps the most chilling reflection on this dark period comes from war correspondent William Lawrence, who wrote, "We are all cannibals. Who has not eaten his brother?" This quote serves as a haunting meditation on the thin veneer of civilization that can crack under extreme circumstances. As we bid farewell to this somber topic, let us remember that history's darkest moments often yield the most crucial lessons about our shared humanity and the imperative to prevent such desperation in the future.